Let me just welcome you all back to our final section or roundtable, wrapping up this amazingly exciting event. My name is Roquinaldo Ferreira. I teach in the History Department at Brown University. I have the job of being the moderator of this roundtable, and I would like to introduce our speakers. I'm going to do that in an extremely concise way. I have apologized to them. I'm not going to be doing justice to their many accomplishments, but that's going to be a way for us to gain time to have the kind of conversation we want to have. I do most of my research on Central Africa and Angola, and just sitting in the audience and listening to the presentations. And I'm a historian who does the kind of boring stuff that goes to archives and reads documents from the 17th and 18th century. So I was blown away by the questions that were raised this afternoon. So I was jealous about the vitality of the intellectual conversations that you guys were having today. But I also do my research in a place where, first of all, it is perhaps or undoubtedly the most important place in the history of the slave trade, Angola. The city of Luanda was the city where perhaps 2.5 million people were taken to the Americans, primarily to Brazil, but not only Brazil, Cuba, and the United States as well. And in that place, we see very little of memorials. There is a museum there, but a microscopic museum that does not reflect at all the history of the slave trade in that area. So the conversation here got me thinking about places without memorials. And what does that say about empowerment of Black people or disenfranchisement of Black people? It made me think as well about the voice of the subaltern, and an issue that came up several times. And I was always, in my mind, going back to this one place where I do my research. The island of Luanda is the central place of the epicenter of the slave trade in Angola, and the epicenter of the slave trade writ large. And it is a place where if we go there today, they have many discos, they have many restaurants, but there is nothing in terms of commemorating the slave trade. It's just heartbreaking. But let me get going here. Our first speaker is David Blight, the director of the Gilder Lehrman Center at Yale University.
It's okay.
They're gonna speak in a different order. I'm just following there. And then we are going to have Professor Anthony Bogues, who is director of our Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice. Professor Marcia Chatelain, who teaches at Georgetown University. Then Professor Martin Hall, who is Deputy Vice Chancellor Emeritus at the University of Cape Town. And then Professor Richard Rabinowitz, who is founder and president of American History Workshop. We are going to begin with Professor Chatelain, and then we are going to follow with the other speakers. Thank you.
Before I begin, I just want to thank all of the entities who sponsored this conference for the invitation. I am a decidedly 20th century historian, and so I come here in my capacity as a former member of Georgetown's Working Group on Slavery, Memory, and Reconciliation, an alum of Brown University's, at the time, Department of American Civilization, a student of Jim Campbell, an admirer of Tony Bogues, and someone who is deeply indebted to the leadership that Ruth Simmons exhibited in her decision to look at Brown University's relationship to slavery. I was joking with one of my co-panelists that this is one of the few times I get to talk about our work at Georgetown in front of an audience that understands the fact of slavery as real and has happened and is still important despite the fact that it happened in the past. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the decision at Georgetown to create a working group, and some of the work that we accomplished over the course of one academic year, and to also touch upon the story that you may be most familiar with as it appeared in the New York Times in April 2015 of the descendant communities of a specific sale of 272 men, women, and children in order to settle some debts that Georgetown University found itself in 1838. So the first thing I tell audiences when they want to know about Georgetown and the history of slavery, it's very important to understand the history of Jesuits in the United States, and particularly to understand that long before the 1838 sale, Jesuit slaveholding was a matter of practice as a result of the relationship American Catholics had to the institution of slavery, and the fact that the specificities of Jesuits owning property and owning resources was often done in a way that allowed the Jesuits to create institutions like Georgetown University and not charge tuition. So one of the ways that our institutions in the United States were able to grow and flourish was because of a relationship to slavery that included plantations across the country, and as well as gifts that were generated as a result of the slave trade. So the particular issue at hand at Georgetown was to think about memorializing a very specific moment in our university's history, and that was the 1838 sale of the 272. One of the questions I often get about this is, how do you know so much about the sale? And one of the consequences of Catholics in the Northeast is that they keep very good records. They keep records of not only the sales of individuals, but baptismal records and death records and marriage records, and all of these documents are in our Georgetown University library, and they're in the collection of the Southern Maryland Jesuits. And so the charge included some components that I'll share with you today. The first was recommendations on how to best acknowledge the university's relationship to the institution of slavery, examine and interpret two buildings that had reopened as residence halls, Milady and McSherry Halls. These halls were named in tribute to two Jesuits who were leaders of the university and oversaw the sale of the 272. And convene events to share the history and initiate dialogue about the history of slavery at Georgetown. As someone who attended graduate school here at the time that Ruth Simmons did this in the early 2000s, I thought, I can't believe I'm living through this again. And I was incredibly nervous, and I don't think I was particularly enthusiastic about the possibility of having the public weigh in on the history of slavery. But one of the things I can say I was pleasantly surprised by are the ways that as a committee, we found ways to engage the history of slavery in ways that made sense for the various communities that we serve as an institution. So the conversations that we had with Catholic institutions, with Jesuit institutions, with members of Washington, D.C., who had been very much alienated from Georgetown University because of gentrification and the removal of African Americans in the surrounding neighborhood, the ways that we talked to staff and students and faculty, all were crafted in mind with what are the ways that this particular community thinks about the issue of the institutional history. I think that it's very important for us to remember the context in which these conversations arose. The conversation at Brown in the early 2000s came out of a reparations conversation that was happening involving the banks that I think Tony talked about yesterday. I think the context in which we did our work was constantly shifting. By the time we convened as a group in August 2015, we had seen the massacre at Mother Emanuel Church in South Carolina and the lowering of the Confederate flag. I think that this oriented our community towards the question about symbols and their ability to be sustainable on our campuses. The movement for Black Lives has played an incredible role in the way that we talk about race and the past at our institutions. The rise of student movements across the country, also shaped the way that we wanted to mark this particular historical moment and how we engage in the past. And I think it's very important to think about that when our group assembled, we were thinking about Charleston and the Confederate flag, and by the time we were leaving for the holiday break in fall, we were thinking about the resignation of a president and a chancellor at the University of Missouri. And when we came back, we were thinking about Yale University and Calhoun College. And we were also thinking about Pope Francis's visit to Washington, D.C., and his call for this year to be the year of mercy and reconciliation. The framework in which we did our work required us to find new names for Freedom and Remembrance Hall. There was a student sit-in in the fall after the working group convened, and we decided to temporarily rename 2 buildings Freedom and Remembrance Halls, which will now become Isaac Hall in commemoration of the first name on the Slave Manifest from 1838, and Anna Maria B. Craft Hall. The hall will be named after a free woman of color who created a school for Black girls and young women outside the gates of Georgetown and was a member of one of the first orders of Black women, a sister of the Oblate Sister of Providence. We had to make sure that our archives were available to whoever wanted to seek them out to do genealogical research. One of the dangers of doing this work in public is that you get a lot of misinformation thrown at you. There was a great conspiracy that we were hiding documents that had belonged to the enslaved peoples on campus, and we had to teach a larger community what an archive is and its availability. We had to think also about ethics and reconciliation in relationship to the present and not only the past. The ways that our practices, the ways that our existence in the city of Washington, D.C. exacerbates the legacy of slavery, Jim Crow, and discrimination. We found this as an opportunity to connect our history to the local history of Washington, D.C. We're in conversations about appropriate memorials on campus to slaveholding and Georgetown, and we've created a very large outreach mechanism that has led to the descendants of that 1838 sale coming back to Georgetown. And the one thing, I'm running out of time, but I want to say one thing about this. This process is not the movie Roots. And the reason why I always say that when I have an opportunity to talk about this is that if we think that this process is only about individuals tracing their steps back to Georgetown University, we have lost the entire battle. This is an opportunity to think about the way that the practices of universities, as they exist today, have not only benefited from slavery, but continue to perpetuate the cycles of inequality that we struggle with. And so in many ways, when the story about the descendants is in the New York Times, we often think about how wonderful it is that these very educated, very bright people are able to trace their roots to Georgetown University. Our descendant communities include people who are languishing in jails, people who will never enjoy full literacy, people who have been disenfranchised by poverty and by various policies of the state that benefit colleges and universities. And so for those in the audience who are part of academic institutions who are so excited to do what Georgetown did, I really want you to keep in mind the great responsibilities of engaging this type of work, not only for the members of the community you see before you, the students, the faculty, the staff, the donors who have a lot of questions, but to be leaders among our institutions to really think about what does it mean to account for the ways that we have benefited from the institution of slavery. Thank you.
On the 9th of March 2015, University of Cape Town student Chumani Maklwele emptied a bucket of excrement over the statue of Cecil John Rhodes. Contacted by the press, the university's spokesperson said that the university was unaware of the protest, but that, quote, UCT is investigating this action and we will take legal steps if it is established that there was an unlawful behavior. 20 long months later, the university's president wrote to staff and students, quote, we face a crisis situation as a university community and a country. Anger and frustration is born of the deep divisions and inequalities of our society, as well as from those many at UCT's experience as a colonial institutional culture. So what had happened in those intervening 20 months? The statue itself had been taken down in April 2015 after a near unanimous vote by a Shaken University Senate. Many believed that this would lead to a familiar process of a committee to consider renaming and memorialization, but it was rather the beginning. There are many complex factors behind the crisis that has disrupted higher education across South Africa for the last 2 years, and which is probably not yet over. Here, and in the context of this conference, I want to concentrate on just one of them, the curriculum. And I should explain here, because to some extent I'm a victim of that very abbreviated introduction, that I'm a historical archaeologist who's written on the archaeology of slavery at the Cape and at the Chesapeake, but I've lapsed into administration. First as a vice president at UCT, and then as president of a university in Britain. That's meant that I've watched the unfolding crisis in South Africa from temporary self-exile in Britain. That enables me to comment without the burden of decision-making. What is a curriculum? We take a curriculum for granted. A curriculum is a course of study, the totality of a student's experience. Modern usage originates in Calvinist theology, the desire to bring order to knowledge. Curriculum, of course, is aligned with the concept of discipline as both the structuring of knowledge and also of punishment. In the broad sense, a university as an organization for creating and disseminating knowledge is both its curriculum and what it means by a discipline. The reflection on museums, public history and slavery over these past 3 days illuminate the work of the university because the museum too has a curriculum, the totality of the visitor experience. Nancy Bacow described the Smithsonian Institution of African American History and Culture as the only Smithsonian institution not, quote, freighted by history. There were no inaugural collections. In contrast, the Smithsonian's other collections are shaped by 2 major periods of collecting, in the 19th century and during the Cold War. This has resulted in the imposition of a typological system. My word, not Nancy's, but I'm an archaeologist. The classifications of empire of the 20th century American exceptionalism. This excluded anything to do with black lives or bodies. There's an analogy here with the 19th century excavations at Great Zimbabwe, which produce a history that this was an outpost of the Queen of Sheba by defining tons of African ceramics, literally tons of African ceramics, and all other traces of settlement as contamination, resulting in the destruction of some 300 years of historical evidence. Excavation is always a selective practice, the definition of evidence always tempered by disciplinary convention. The consequence of this has been a freezing of Africa's rich and complex history in the imagination of the West as a kind of permanent Disney World Lion King. The university curriculum is also freighted with history and tempered by disciplinary convention, the weight of texts, interpretation and evidence that defines the discipline. It is also complicated by interests, which is why some of the most sustained conflicts over curriculum are fought in departmental meetings. Leading a university of president was easier for me than trying to change the curriculum as chair of a department. Curriculum as a classification system both legitimizes and excludes. What are the implications for exclusion of forms of knowledge when, as Tony Bogues put it, quoting James Baldwin, we carry history within us? This is particularly so when the personal memory is also part of collective trauma. Now, leadership of a university is invariably implicated in its curriculum, either by doing nothing or by taking active responsibility for the university's intellectual project. By late 2015, the Rhodes issue had spread from Cape Town to Oxford, largely because of the agency of Mandela Rhodes scholars, and demands that a similar statue at Oriel College be removed. This posed challenges, leadership challenges for both Oriel and Oxford. Oriel discovered democracy and overwhelming support from its alumni and community that the statue should stay. Chris Patten, Chancellor of Oxford and the last governor of Hong Kong, took a different tack. evoking freedom of speech to defend Rhodes and his legacy, and suggesting that protesters should, quote, think about being educated elsewhere. Oxford's the world's #1 university and does not have to learn from any other institution. But fortunately, other institutions don't have to learn from Oxford. Which brings us to Brown. Here's a quote from the final paragraph of the Slavery and Justice Report from 10 years ago. Universities must provide leadership. They're institutions that value historical continuity, that recognize and cherish the bonds that link the present to the past and the future. Throughout the report, there's an interplay between restorative justice and the opportunities for curriculum. And indeed, the committee produced a curriculum on slavery and its consequences in New England, which was distributed to every high school in the state. In her talk opening this conference, President Simmons reprised this emphasis. She sees the lasting effect of the Slavery and Justice Report as establishing the foundations for an insistence on truth and transparency, the obligation and burden of truth-telling. She sees positive unrest as an opportunity for universities. She would not be appreciated by Chancellor Patton. How can we give new life to the idea of curriculum, more than the technical work of writing, course descriptions, and determining credit values? Here I found Diana Taylor's work in performance studies useful, the distinction between what she calls archive and repertoire. The play between archive and repertoire is the strength of the exhibition that was opened at this conference, Black Mechanics. The juxtaposition of archive poetry and art, the records of the Rhode Island slave trade, Evie Shockley's poem, Jerry Augusto's mixed media assemblage, Negro Cloth and Kesey, Joseph Holston's paintings, and the direct association with political action, being, as the catalogue puts it, alert to shadows while facing the tough questions of today. This shows how memory making itself should be part of an engaged and appropriate curriculum. These opportunities were demonstrated in many of the rich presentations of this conference. I started listing these from yesterday, but had so many more today that I've abandoned the attempt. In conclusion. The trick here, of course, is to say in conclusion many times. But in conclusion...
Got that right.
Because the curriculum is about choice, the legitimation of some knowledge and the exclusion of other possibilities, it is also and always about power. And because it's about power, it's also and always about politics. Wayne Modest at this conference, quoting James Baldwin, "You are here, and to be here means that you can't be anywhere else." Our work everywhere is now in a time of anxious politics. In turn, anxious politics demands distributed leadership across all levels of a university. Without this, as Jim Campbell argued, there is the probability of progressive paralysis and recourse to destructive nostalgia for a lost supremacy. Grounded, that is, in hatred. This emergence of destructive nostalgia now characterizes politics across Europe and the United States. But there is hope. At the University of Cape Town's campus this last October, where the whiff of tear gas and the standoff with students and police was accompanied by burnt-out cars, there was a sense of overwhelming despair. But in the midst of this, the university's theatre staged a play called The Fall, a compelling dramatisation of the issues that led to the removal of Rhodes' statue, written and performed by drama graduates who themselves had been caught up in the protests. The play was compelling, funny, heartbreaking, and played to full audiences of every background to standing ovations. As long as there's this kind of combination of ability, integrity, and creativity, a university is still alive. Thank you.
I'm Richard Rabinowitz. I want to thank all of the organizers and thank all of you for still sticking it out to this late hour on a Saturday afternoon, beautiful Saturday afternoon in the fall. This conference, I think, has been a lot about transformational experiences, and actually one of the first ones for me has been Rex Ellis's story, almost the very first session. He told a story, some of you may not have been here, about something that comes out of the WPA slave narrative archive, in which he describes a woman who was being whipped by her mistress on a plantation for hours and hours, it seemed, and tortured and just screaming and howling with pain. And finally, sort of half exhausted, the mistress stopped, and the woman who was being whipped said to her, you know, if I were in your situation, and if I were you, I wouldn't have the heart to keep whipping me. And as Rex described this more dramatically than I can, the person was so affected by this that she just stopped. And I thought, I'd love to just do a museum about that anecdote. I think it's a powerful, there are so many elements in it. There are so many questions that are in it. And it's been the kind of experience that I think I try to, when I develop a project for a museum, to really focus on those kinds of transformative things and see if we can figure out how to bring them to visitors. Over the course of a very long career in this business, I started, it'll be a half century next month since I became a museum person. I've seen an enormous change, and this conference is going to be the confirmation of that, of the museum from a repository, with a kind of squeaky door to the repository, occasionally letting visitors in, and having constantly to justify that it was an educational institution, to a place of enormously creative activity, a vehicle, and we've been saying often a verb and not a noun. And I'm just extraordinarily proud to be a part of that change and to see that happen. The first time I gave a professional talk in 1970 at a meeting in Portland, Oregon, I found this paper, and I remarked in that paper that there wasn't a single instance in the United States in 1970 as yet in which the world of non-white people, of immigrants, of poor people, of working class people was being represented very much in historical museums or preservation projects. It's an extraordinary thing that's happened in those days, before Ellis Island and Angel Island were turned in, or Manzanar, the Japanese internment center, were turned into National Park Service sites. For me, I began my experience in museums not as a curator or historian or the expert, but as a visitor. And I just had an extraordinary experience in January of 1967. I've just written a book. I'm going to put a plug out for this book called Curating America, that sort of describes the progression of my work and my time since 1967. I was a visitor to an outdoor history museum in central Massachusetts called Old Sturbridge Village, and I was so stunned by the fact of the materiality of the past and my ignorance of that materiality through the years I'd been studying in school, that I dropped out of graduate school that evening and came the next day and talked myself into a job as a costumed interpreter for $1.10 an hour working there. And that's always been the center of my interest in this work, is what is the experience that the visitor has? What is the focal point of how does the time visitors spend in this space? And I think we need to spend more time. We have spent a lot of time in this conference on the content of our work and on the kind of intentions we have for the kind of media that we've employed, but to really focus on how the visitor takes it in. To use the word curriculum, in the 70s we learned that there was a difference between the curriculum of intent and the curriculum of effect. What actually was happening to the visitor? And I want to sort of draw your attention or pull your interest toward the fine-grained experience that visitors have. For me, the visitor's experience is temporal as well as spatial. When we sit down to work on the design of an exhibition gallery, the designers are often thinking in spatial terms. But I really like thinking, because I came out of the world of the theater first, I really focus on how much time the visitor is going to spend. We may have visitors who spend many hours in a museum, but any of us who really work with education know that visitors have one good hour, and then they may linger and they may push themselves to do many, many more. But ultimately, that first good hour is something that really can't be wasted and needs to be used. So that's the temporal experience, the arc of that experience that's so important. The visitor creates a narrative of her own experience as she moves through the gallery that we create. That narrative is in some ways parallel to the historical narrative, to the historical content that we are developing, to what I call the storyscape. There may also be an academic pathway that's parallel to that as well, which is really how scholars have worked through this. All of these journeys are built around what I would call epistemologies of transformation. Museum visitors have intermittent attentiveness, and we need to really design and figure out how it is that they become comfortable in this space. How do we acknowledge and confirm that this is a space that is really appropriate for them? And what do we do then to develop a series of experiences that are sensory motor experiences that really use all of their physicality, their eyes and their ears, but their hands, the quality of being in a space, the surface, the color of the space, the light. How do we use their abilities to decode, to understand and translate elements from one set of meanings to another? How do we use dialogue? How do we create a balance between, this has happened in a lot of the conversations this weekend, between immersion, in which they really feel themselves densely engaged in the history, historical situation, and overview. And if you know the work of Jay Appleton, the great psychologist of landscape, the balance and the rhythm of immersion and interview are very important. And finally, how do we provide opportunities for visitors to conclude even those small units of their visit with what I would call externalization? If you know the work of Jerome Bruner, the great cognitive scientist, psychologist, he argues that the visitor needs to have an opportunity to externalize his or her learning before they leave the space of the museum. When we did the Slavery in New York show, it was very useful for us to create a video talkback station, and 10,000 visitors gave us 10 minutes of reaction to what they had. And we discovered subsequently that those visitors who had that opportunity retained and experienced that in a much more powerful way than those visitors who didn't. So what I'm suggesting is that as we move forward in this field, we need to pay our attention very much more precisely to what are the things that we are doing in the visit that are equipping people for the kinds of transformations that happened to that woman in the story that Rex was telling us, for changing their relationship. I remember we're doing Slavery in New York. One young woman, very well-spoken, sat before the camera in the talkback station and said she'd been a New Yorker all of her life, gone to public school and then to Columbia and then to Cornell Law School. And this was the first moment as she went through that exhibit that she realized that that the people who built Wall Street, where she was now working, looked a lot more like her than they did like the other people in her office. And it was the first time, she said, that I don't feel as though I'm an outsider in my own hometown. And I thought that was an extraordinary kind of way for the museum to demonstrate its power. So as we go forward, I hope that we will sort of put more energy and attention to how the story of enslavement and emancipation can be understood experientially in these kind of more in the micro moments, so that we can actually find a way to equip our visitors to make those changes in their personal lives. Thank you.
Thank you all for hanging around. I counted you. We've still got almost 70 people here. That's not bad. That's very good. I don't want to give up my time, but Jacques has an announcement about how cheap flights are to Guadeloupe. I didn't want us to forget this.
Thank you. Just for those, Guadeloupe is not far from the United States. But no, it's 4 hours flight from Boston, New York, and
see 250.
We'll plan the field trip. Tony Center will pay for it. I'm going to make 4 very quick points. These kinds of roundtables are difficult, obviously, to figure out what. I kept a list too, Martin, and I've given up really on the list of all the great points made by individuals, so I'm not going to name too many people. I want to start with, though, an idea that we actually started the report at Yale with. There's no reason any of you have read the thing yet, but the report I mentioned that was issued yesterday about renaming, and we have a paragraph about the necessity of humility in the face of complicated pasts, and that humans ought to exercise humility in how we judge the past. Then we went on to state our principles. But there's not a lot of humility in our culture right now, but sometimes we need to remind ourselves it's a good trait, usually. Ruth Simmons said many things the other night. She said that universities are in a crisis of integrity, and Martin Hall just showed us one fantastic illustration of that. They are, we are, of all kinds, not just about our past with slavery. She also said that telling the truth is unassailable. And that's a fantastic notion, of course. I love that idea. I don't think it's true. The truth gets assailed all the time, or what we think is the truth. I think I know what she was saying. Come on, you find the truth and tell it. Don't be afraid of it. I think I know what she was saying, but it isn't always unassailable, especially if it's a hard truth. That's what we keep learning. Here are my 4 little points. Back to shared histories. We've heard a lot about shared histories. It's a simple idea in a way, right? We've all spent our lives trying to do this. At least I started as a high school teacher in the 1970s, where we were teaching something called Black History with no books, basically. We had John Hope Franklin's textbook. But Ralph Ellison once wrote simply, he said, "We tell ourselves our individual stories so that we can know our collective story." That's a simple idea, but it's absolutely true. But the problem is that there is always a politics of shared history. There is, whether it's in a textbook, in a curriculum, in who gets to decide what's taught, who gets to decide what memorial goes in that space and what's on that memorial. There is always a politics to a shared history. That's what makes it fascinating, and that's what makes it hard. I used to always criticize textbooks until I started to try to write one. And I'm a co-author with 5 other people on an American history textbook for colleges. And now you're suddenly, you got to tell the whole story from all the multiplicity. And I gained a lot of humility, and now I don't criticize textbooks, now that I have one out there on the market. There's always a politics to trying to do a shared history. Let's just remember that. Secondly, we've talked so much, and rightly so, about history and memory and the word legacies. And I don't want to get too school-marmish here, but we didn't always stop and define what we meant, which is okay. But history and memory are not the same thing. It's worth keeping that in mind. History tends to be, I think, what trained professionals do. Memory is what everybody else has, and there are a lot more of them than of us. There always will be. I remember being at a conference once at the German Historical Institute in Washington. It was all about race. It's got to be 10 years ago or 15 years ago. And we had an opening panel, brilliant anthropologists, brilliant people on this opening panel about the notion of race as a biological concept and as a social construct. It was an amazing panel. Now, of course, the whole argument was race is a social construct, and they were showing it in 1,000 ways. Sidney Mintz, no less than Sidney Mintz, the great anthropologist who taught us all so much about the transformation of African cultures in the Caribbean, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, was then delivering the keynote after that. And Sid got up and he said, "God, that was a brilliant panel. The trouble is, everybody walking by out there in the street in Washington, D.C. doesn't believe any of it." which was his way of saying, I think, that's where the public history is. Let's remember what we know they don't know, and they don't believe it. Race is not biological. Go out in the street. You know, it's just, we're always up against the street, was Sid's point. Anyway, the memory is in the street. We're creating the best history, but the memory's out there. Third, we've talked a great deal, and rightly so, about the nature of the sacred. In fact, today, all the panels today have been kind of working this theme of, okay, got it, of the elegiac in memorialization, in art, the sacred space. And I found it very moving in many of the talks and contexts. And we have to do this. This, you know, slavery and the slave trade, I've always felt, is something that has always needed to be mourned before it can be learned. And it all depends on the context of when can people mourn? When is it safe to mourn? When do people feel secure enough to mourn? How do they mourn? From what tradition? Then comes the history. Maybe it's in the other order. The sacred is terribly important, but the risk, of course, and this has been said, I think Jim Campbell said it somehow on our opening panel, the elegiac mode can lead to an avoidance of politics. The sacred can lead us to an almost complete avoidance of politics. We just feel. And that's all, we can't help it sometimes. We just feel. But the elegiac mode can also lead to a ferocious politics that isn't just about feeling. It can go both ways. And it's always a matter of, and nobody knows quite how, it's always a matter of how to harness it. And last, I've been talking to Wayne a lot, on the bus and so on, about this ephemeral, loose idea of hope. And I have a pretty dark, a few of you know me well, I have a pretty dark view of history. That's why I'm always asking about tragedy. I never believed that line Obama loves and quotes from King, who quoted it from somebody, that the arc of history always bends toward justice. No, it doesn't. Why are we here? No, it doesn't. And we just had an election that proved it. But sometimes it bends that way. But we all want to believe that. But anyway, but we all want to hope, especially when you study these subjects. We all want to hope. And a lot of you use the word hope at times in presentations. There's hope in that image. There's hope in that idea. There's hope in that conception. Last point. When I first started writing on Frederick Douglass, which was in my dissertation way back when, the first chapter of that first book I ever wrote was called Sources of Hope. It was a dumb title, but it was Sources of Hope in the Pre-Civil War Thought of Frederick Douglass. I mean, that's not a very elegant title. But I was trying to understand, how did a former slave, black abolitionist, now a radical political abolitionist, sustain hope in the 1850s in the United States? Why did he keep hope at all after the Compromise of 1850, after the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and especially after the Dred Scott case, which said to black people, get out of this country? And it made me look into his ideas and his thought to understand, okay, he got part of this from a kind of a Christian conception of history. He got it from faith on some level, which all people do at some level. He got some of it from a conception of human nature, believe it or not. He actually believed goodness would outweigh evil in human nature. He did, most of the time. He believed in the natural rights tradition. He just kept drawing off the Enlightenment. He just said, these ideas that came from the Enlightenment, they're just so strong they have to endure. They have to win. And then he drew hope from his work, that he could go edit that newspaper, that he could go out and give those speeches, that he could wield language the way he could wield it. And that brings us back to us. It seems we've been saying for 2.5 days, you know, we may be living in a dark time politically now. We just had a transformative event that a lot of us didn't like, but look at the work we're doing. Hope sometimes comes because we just get up and do what we do about subjects that matter, and we know they matter because people push back and they care. I think we should also go through life with a genuine sense of tragedy. Otherwise, we just keep getting surprised by history, don't we? But there are ways to hope, even in the face of all these matters. And the kind of work we're doing here, and the kind of, in fact, I find, last point, sorry, I can't write, I'm not going to write fiction, but I have so much envy for the artist, as hard as it is to do, as I do think they can take us places that our scholarship sometimes can't. I think scholarship's important, very important. But I so envy the artist who can go places they even don't know when they begin. Thank you.
I want to thank you all for staying, and we will do a thanks to everybody after this. And like I think Martin and David, I gave up after two, 3 pages of trying to synthesize what I think was happening. But I think there are a few things I would like to highlight. The first is that, to begin with, Ruth's notion of truth-telling. And I think there are 2 things about that. One is speaking truth to power. That is, always having a certain critical attitude towards power and authority itself. And I think that's part of what the call was. But secondly, when she was talking about truth-telling, what came to my mind was the business of historical truth, because she was also talking about slavery. And so one begins to think, how does one tell that historical truth, and why is that historical truth important? And it's important, obviously, for 2 reasons. One, it is repressed, generally, or just given a passing touch. Or if it is not repressed, it is elided. It is not seen as an integral part of history or historical past, but is seen as an aberration, something outside of the mainstream that we may want to think about and teach, but that really it is an aberration. And so I think the business of truth-telling is not just about finding a single truth, but is really trying to find a way in which a certain kind of historical truth about a certain past can be foregrounded and can be really be part of trying to understand what forces shape our particular society. So what struck me as well was 2 comments that were made about people who had been into the African American Museum in DC. First comment was, "This is our story." And the second comment was, "They cannot take this away from us." Those 2 comments gave me pause within the context of historical truth, and within the context of me thinking about Baldwin's notion of history within us. And so one begins to think about, what then is the work of history? Not now as a specific set of discipline professionalization process that emerges in the 19th century in Europe, but what is the work of history? How does it work? How does it work in a public space? What claims does a citizen have to make in relationship to history? What is our responsibilities as scholars who may write history or in one form or the other in that process of a kind of claim that history has to make? Is it that we write history just to say, okay, we have to be accurate on this, or this has to happen and we have to be clear and so on? And all of that is important, but there is a work of history itself. That is not just the that not just the writing of history, but the actual work that history does itself, not just the writing that we have to do. And so that I was trying to think about that, particularly when questions like what Wayne and others were raising around citizenship and belonging and questions of freedom and justice. Because those claims of citizenship and those claims of belonging are also around claims of history. Around claims, some would say shared history, and we would argue about the politics of that shared history, but they are also about historical claims. And one of the reasons I think that is important to think about the work of history is that if you think about racial slavery, that one of the foundational claims of racial slavery as a human classificatory system is that Africans had no history. And therefore, when people begin to say, and there are all sorts of historical responses to that, and we have some of us have written about it, vindicationist history, transformationary history, and so on, that history that emerges out of the black claim to try and understand this historical process that put us, particularly on this side of the Atlantic. But I think that what one is trying to think, what the two persons are saying, this is our story, and they can't take this away from us. That what they're trying to say is that we have now a particular history that is there. And that history, we may have all sorts of problems with it, and we may have to correct parts of it and so on, but the claim of history, of being historical, is actually a claim that is being made. And that claim to be an historical being, human being, I think is something that is actually important. And that's why the questions of citizenship and belonging, I think, also invoke this question of history. We had a long discussion, obviously, and work on questions of history and memory. I actually thought that the last panel illuminated those things very, very well. And the question of memory being in part of the everyday is important. I also think that one has to think very carefully about how to capture, and I put that in quotation marks, how to capture memory in its relationship to so-called formal historical writing. And what does that mean to think through those things? What does it mean methodologically? And also, obviously, what it means for public history. But I think the business of work, of memory being really living in the spaces, which is, I think, something you said, is really important, because there's also then the work of memory. And even though that's distinctive from the historical interpretation in the conventional sense, I think it is also something that we need to think about, because it's also a way in which questions of citizenship, of belonging, of who and what we are, is actually framed and worked through. My final comment really was inspired by the folks who quoted Derek Walcott. And Walcott has in a remarkable essay called Muse of History, in a book called Twilight, in which essays on the Twilight, in which he argues that there's a way in which the naming of something takes place when, in fact, people take something, reorganize it, readapt it, and begin to call it something else. And it would seem to me that this question of naming is actually very important for creativity and for creation, but also very important for this business of hope. Because hope is not the opposite of despair. It's not the kind of dialectical underside. Hope is really about, in my view, thinking about possibilities. And sometimes possibilities don't seem to be available on the horizon. But I like to think all the while, and I put it really very simply, that if my grandmother did not have hope, I wouldn't be teaching at Brown University. All right? And that there is a way if she didn't have hope, she would have been still on a plantation, not in a free village in the countryside of Jamaica. And that therefore, that even though possibilities and horizons always look dark and always look constrained, that what keeps people, what keeps hope is not a kind of we can't be despaired because people will be despaired. But what keeps hope is always the possibility, and I think I said this earlier on, is always the possibility of life. And that therefore history has this arc, but I don't think it is a kind of unbending arc. I don't think it's an arc that just, kind of keeps on going up and up. I think it's an arc that does this, that comes back down, that goes around, that comes back up, right? And it's not really an arc, right?
May not have an arc at all.
Is that it is actually about, and is not progress, is actually about people attempting in their everyday life and people attempting to always try and see how they can live a little bit better than what they have at this point in time. And that to me is really very, very important. And I would want to say that the work as I see it of public history and what some of us call the public humanities is really about trying to lay grounds for that, to give people a certain historical, a certain sense of possibilities so that they can have some firmer, clearer ground to try and live a little better. Thanks.
I think we can now turn the conversation over to you. We can field questions. A few days ago, I got this email with instructions about how to go about this. The instructions, according to the instructions, I should spend 15 minutes or 10 minutes trying to frame the conversation. But I'm going to take a far more organic approach by allowing you to ask questions to the panel.
It's become a tradition here already.
I have the mic.
Okay.
So I'd like to just say thank you again for this amazing 3 days. Of course, a natural question from this is, where do we go from here? What's the vision that you as a panel see following this? Hopefully this is not the one and only, but the first of many. I think the networking and the collaboration and the new connections that we've made, for me, have just made the 3 days extremely precious. So I'd like to hear, though, from you as the organizers and the panelists, what do you see as the future from where we should take all of this new knowledge and information?
To the streets. No. Well, we're willing to collaborate with anybody on a conference, on fellowships, on all sorts of things. Tony and I have talked about the possibility of a book coming out of this, to be determined. Some of you will hear from us. But, whether we'll do another conference next year on public history, I doubt it. I mean, we might let it sit a while. We might not let it sit for 9 or 10 years as we did the last time. Maybe there's a way of doing a conference again around public history that's even more focused, than this was the global public history. There might be something that we could focus more precisely on. We try to plan our conferences a year in advance at least. We've got 2 ideas going for next year, but they're quite different from this. One is my colleagues in ancient history at Yale have come to us and said, "You've never done a conference on slavery in antiquity." And I said, "You're right. What a great idea." So that's very different from this. And there's one other idea, but I don't know. Tony, you have, about the book or otherwise, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think David is right. I mean, we will, we have discussed the book, and obviously we have to sit down and think about it and come back to people. But I think that there are two things. One, Jennifer, right? One is that I think people here have formed their own networks. And my hope is that those networks that have been formed here will continue without our kind of centralizing intervention and so on. And I really, because I think that's important. The second thing is I think that there is in this particular moment in United States, I can't speak for anywhere else, there is a real interest in something that's called public humanities vaguely. The Yale people I know, our colleagues have been trying to do something. There's a Northeastern, there's an attempt to form a Northeastern Association of different people who are interested in that field, and I am increasingly beginning to think that this kind of rubric may allow for a set of exchanges and work collaborations between people who are formally in academic formally and people who are formally outside of the academy. But and that's one of the things I hope that we could do. That slavery is one such issue, obviously. But there's a whole issue that is not coming to this room today, or last few days. But one of the things that we have seen, or in the moment that we are now living, is a way in which race has resurged in ways that we never thought possible. Again, we thought not that it was dead and buried, but it was on the margins. There's some crazy people outside there, right? But it has reemerged, and it hasn't just reemerged politically in the mainstream. It has reemerged in science. You just have to read the Lancet and some scientific journals, prestigious scientific journals, to see the way in which race and race making is really taking over fields like genetics and so on. Not taking over, but are becoming important in a discussion. So I would have, and I would have thought that something like that, for example, is really very important. And it's not just an academic thing. It's not just for us, as scholars of race or whoever, historians or intellectual historians or whatever. It is really something that has to do with the society. And we need to have a really frank discussion about that, in my view, researchers. There are other things, but I've just signaled that because I've become very preoccupied with it. Right?
You have time to read science journals? That's amazing.
We have two other reactions of response to this question here on the panel.
Two maybe more specific things in response. I mean, first of all, what struck me coming out of many of the presentations is that there's a space here for a new global conversation about slavery.
Yeah.
From very different perspectives. I mean, to relate it very specifically to your question, the Dutch East India Company, you focused on the Dutch West India Company. What a fascinating extension it would be to take the work that's been done on the Dutch West India Company and translate it to the Dutch East India Company. There's a whole other realm of slavery that embraces the Cape, a very different sort of slavery, leading to very different consequences. We saw the fascinating resonance, a complicated resonance of slavery today in Senegal, and what that means. A set of reactions that people here have difficulty in understanding, despite all of the years of scholarship behind slavery. So there's another conversation about slavery there that is only partial. And I've come away with an extraordinary sense of how rich the conversation about slavery in the United States is, and how much it has to contribute to that a new notion of a discussion of slavery in a world context. But the second thing then would also be about universities. What's happening in the conversation in Georgetown right now has extraordinary resonances for the conversation in Cape Town. We all tend to create an exceptionalism. So maybe it's a difficulty of being at the tip of another continent 30 hours away, but the conversation at the University of Cape Town carries on as if this is only happening there.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But when you get into the discourse of Black Lives Matter, the hashtag protests across the world. When you look at what's happening among black British students, for example, protesting the history of slavery at the University of Bristol or in Liverpool, you find the same conversations, the same phrases going on. And there's a local conversation about universities and a global conversation. And for me, another phrase I'll take away is this notion of anxious politics. Because at a time when you're getting a resurgence across Europe to a very destructive nostalgia, a very different sort of memory of the past, which is all about immigrants, all about closing borders, all about an imagined history that didn't really exist, that's reclaimed in the sense of nostalgia, whether it's about the history of making America great or having Europe return back to a history that never actually happened of closed borders. Universities have such a central role in fighting that. So in the framework that David and Tony have talked quite generally, I would hope to hold on to the specifics of some of these issues that have been so deeply grounded in the conversations over the last 3 days.
Would you like to?
I just want to say something perhaps a lot simpler. What we desperately need is some sort of higher journalism to do a kind of critical review of the extraordinarily wide range. The programs that have been talked about here are really not well understood among the wider public. And we don't have journalists, who really are addressing this and in serious ways. So the public's understanding of what public humanities or public history is much, it's really weak in that way. And while we can really find increasingly sophisticated ways of exploring the issues that have come up this week, we also need just to find ways of understanding how this fits into a kind of conversation in the country at large, because I just feel as though there's a really tremendous gulf, and it's getting wider, and the organs of that kind of criticism are diminishing to some extent. We used to have Ed Rothstein used to write for the New York Times and occasionally would say something quite rich about that. He's no longer there. And so we're missing that kind of critical perspective that in places. And I think whatever we can do to write in professional journals, but also in organs that have a wider circulation, I think that would be extremely valuable.
Would you like to?
I'll wait.
Paul?
Can I?
Can I? Just a quick
Okay.
thought.
Julian has
Two thoughts. First, fantastic closing, of the conference. Two things come to my mind. One is what the hope is in the work is extremely powerful idea. It's extremely powerful idea. It's not simple, but it's extremely powerful. And I would suggest that what I feel is underlying all this conversation is a real call and an invitation, the truth-telling that Ruth Simmons talked about, and Tony, you continue to tell us about, and the examples that you've gave on the panel. To me, it's an invitation to reclaim our role, our multiple roles as public intellectuals. And public intellectuals that have the public, number kind of high up as a concept. And the word intellectual, perhaps reminding ourselves, Said's talks, the representation of the intellectual. 1993, the BBC talks where Edward Said, where he suggested that the intellectual is a concerned member of society, and he has to speak up, let's say, to make it very short. But that's, to me, a very interesting thing that is somehow underlying all this conversation. And I appreciate very much you reminding at least myself of that. Thank you.
So we have Paul and Marcella.
I'm sorry. I've been waiting. Can I make a comment, please?
Okay.
Yeah.
I
Please.
want to thank the organizers very much for what has been very stimulating 2 days of conversation and reflection. But I want to pick up on a point that started with Ibrahima's presentation yesterday, and that was taken up then by the moderator of this session. And that has got to do with the ways in which that Africans remember the slave trade. And I think that this is a point that deserves much more attention. And I can only give one example from the case that I know best, which is the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where there are different, say, regional, but also a national discourse about slavery. And the regional discourse, the regional memory, popular memory, is located for obvious reason in the region that was most touched by the transatlantic slave trade. And people are still awaiting the return of their relatives who were transported to the Americas. And there is in popular culture a very strong fascination with, for instance, also American culture. And it is no coincidence that the two most famous orchestras in Congolese popular music are called African jazz and OK jazz. And it's not because people appreciate jazz music, quite on the contrary. When Louis Armstrong came to Leopoldville at the end of the 1950s, people flocked to see him, but they did not appreciate his music at all. They did not consider American jazz music as their music in the sense that they do think that Cuban music is their music because they recognize the rhythms. But they have this very strong awareness that African Americans, like slaves that were transported to Latin Americans, were their relatives. And hence there is a very strong fascination with African American culture, even if people do not necessarily appreciate it. And that also plays a very important role in messianistic religions in the region. And one self-proclaimed prophet, Simon Kimbangu, who started preaching during the 1920s, prophesied that all those transported slaves would return to the region. And in order to speed up that process, after he died, his followers in his native village started to creating guest houses for when indeed all those transported slaves would return. And a few years ago, I was lodged in one of the guest houses that is set up specifically for African Americans. So that's on the regional level, but there's also a national a memory about slave trade that takes two forms. That is very important into the forging of a national identity, the idea that all Congolese, and we're talking about a country the size of Western Europe, 70 million people, share a history of suffering, consider themselves a community of suffering. First of all, in terms of the extraction by foreigners. They describe their history since the time of the transatlantic slave trade as a history of extraction. First they came for the slaves, then they came for the ivory, then they came for the rubber, then they came for copper, then they came for diamonds, then they came for cobalt, then they came for coltan, and now apparently they are returning for the cobalt, which they are no longer used primarily for color dyes, but apparently is now a very important element for making electric cars. So that's the way, so they interpret their relations with the outside world, and more particularly the West, in terms of extraction, from which slavery was the first form. But internally, they also will translate their relations with their leaders in terms of slavery, i.e. Both the colonial system and dictatorship are seen as transformations of slavery. People say during the colonial era we were slaves or we were like slaves. Under the dictatorship of Mobutu and now under the dictatorship of Joseph Kabila, we are slaves, we are like slaves. And they also represent that as such, for instance, in popular painting. there are very few representations of the transatlantic slave trade in popular painting as opposed to the so-called Arab slave trade. But the colonial period is represented by people who are in chains. Independence is represented by Patrice Lumumba, the first prime minister of the Congo, breaking the chains and leading his people to freedom. And in very much the same sense, the leader of the opposition, Etienne Tshisekedi, who was first the leader of the opposition under Mobutu and now under the current president, is represented in exactly the same way. He breaks the chains, he leads his people to freedom, on the road to freedom and to liberty.
May I ask you to shorten your...
Yes, I will
It breaks my heart because I'm an Africanist and I love what you're saying, but we have other people here that want to weigh in on the conversation.
What I want to say is that the memory is there, and if there are no monuments to commemorate the slave trade, I'm pretty sure that people are not against it, but on the other hand, they do not need the monuments because they remember the slave trade, because it's actually, it forms part of their everyday experience. It's like a ghost, just like the ghost of Leopold II, that is always there, and that people talk about endlessly without them necessarily having the need to actually materialize it in a monument.
I would be very keen to do a conference on the memory of slavery within Africa. You just gave the keynote address, actually. I think. And a lot of us have encountered this at a conference in Ghana. I encountered this once when Nigerians sort of all fell out arguing with each other about who was the descendant and who wasn't. But that's a sensitive, fascinating, big topic. I would be keen to, if you know the right people, to help.
And I would say we will do it together.
Well, all right, we're doing that one together, and we can. That's a great topic, and it's a huge story, and it's probably never been done on this shore on that topic. Maybe it has. I don't know. Anyway.
So
great
we
idea.
have Paul and Marcella.
I hate to break the rhythm of that because that is really what we should be talking about. And I think that, you know, I regret that we didn't have Bambi up here. But I guess I'll attempt to, I thought where you ended in terms of the living memory, the living, breathing memory of slavery. In that in the certain political, social context you're thinking about, makes me think about these questions that you raised of hope and work, and fashioning of a new language and the movement of time. Because I think some of what we've talked about that has recurred over the course of a variety of conversations this weekend has been about this idea of the need to fashion a new language in a variety of spaces and places. But at the same time, I was also struck by the way in which the spirit of language from Baldwin was evoked throughout, from Glissant, from Césaire, from Walcott. And it made me think a little bit about, you know, and so I guess in terms of this question of how time moves, I would throw another, I will put my own quote to the table, which was from Arnaud Bontemps, from his epigraph to Black Thunder, a book written in 1936 about Gabriel's revolt, failed slave rebellion. And the epigraph says, "Time is not a river, time is a pendulum." And whether or not we accept that movement of time, to think about his period of time when a tremendous amount of work was being done. Perhaps this time is different. Our time is different with different conditions and different work and different relations of power. But when he's writing that book, Du Bois is writing Black Reconstruction. CLR James has just written Black Jacobins and is mounting a production on the London stage about to starring Paul Robeson. Hal Woodruff is painting murals that are to be displayed in Talladega College, right?
Jacob Lawrence is doing the first
Jacob Lawrence
two
is doing a
series.
series on Toussaint Louverture, on Harriet Tubman, on Frederick Douglass. WPA field workers are beating the back roads throughout the South, not the urban North, to find ex-slaves, to capture those interviews. Margaret Mitchell is writing Gone with the Winds, which will be made into the most powerful
Let's do a
film.
conference called 1935.
Right? So at the same time, I guess what I'm trying to say
That could be fun.
the conversations are new, but they're also old. And that leads me to, I guess, the sense of hope and work. And
Can I-
the work that was produced then was produced with a sense of hope of change. And it's and all I want to make reference to, again, is for us, if we're on a pendulum swing backward, the necessity of our work, the necessity of this work collaboratively, across institutions, individually, and expanding upon that kind of work is essential. And that's really my comment. And
If I could comment about that, I think these are both very powerful reflections. The one thing I will say as someone who's sitting at a university that is trying to figure out something about the past, I think that the capacity to do the work differently has changed, but the power has not shifted. And so when you were talking about the New York Times and their capacity in a particular moment to understand public history, I also know that the New York Times and other news organizations, their capacity to talk about race has also shifted because of the diversity in the newsroom, because we have young reporters who took our classes and their ability to interpret what is happening has changed, but their access to the front page, to the powerful positions to actually narrate that story has not shifted. And so one of the things that is very difficult for me on a campus that I feel like sometimes it's like Groundhog Day, like I'm at Brown back in the early 2000s, is that our capacity as Georgetown University to engage this work has changed because we have a more diverse faculty, we have women at a university that used to be an all-men's university. We have a sophistication in our understanding about the history of slavery because of the types of scholarship that's out there. So our capacity to contend with the past is so much greater than it has ever been. But the question is, do we have a fundamental shift in power of where the leadership across these issues has changed? And that's where I have big questions.
Do you have a question, Marcel?
So I wanted to say that I have been fascinated by our capacity to think deeply and collectively about how we are positioning our work in relation to concepts such as memory, history, race, and citizenship, among others. Yet it seems to me that we've been less reflexive about the narratives and the normativities of freedom that are implicit in our work as well. And so during the last couple of days, I've been wondering, and I just couldn't find the right moment to ask these questions to some of you who were talking about your own involvement in public history. What is the understanding of freedom that we are espousing? Are we assuming that freedom is a universal or even a historical value? I think that this is definitely a political dimension of the way in which we are using and defining these concepts that require scrutiny. And for example, I was very interested to ask actually about the way in which the Smithsonian exhibit, which I understood ties together, it's about slavery and freedom, right? So I would be very interested to see how that plays out in that exhibit, what is the relationship between slavery and freedom? Who are the free or who are the ones who become free? What is the periodization of freedom in the exhibit? But again, I didn't get to ask this before, so I don't know if it will be now taken up as a question. So I think perhaps this could be part 2 of the meeting. Freedom in public history. I mean, in terms of, well, I think they cannot be separated, and that's why I think it might be problematic that we didn't talk about them together.
Right, we might even be able to trick the Republican Party into funding that one.
For example.
Sorry.
For example.
We have another person.
Yes. I'm going back to sort of the original question of next steps. And as much as I very much love being in the rarefied air of a 3-day academic conference, I am a secondary school teacher of history. And I teach primarily these days world history, having retooled from being a Europeanist. And part of changing the narrative is also getting down to the textbook level and getting some of this information, speaking collaboratively, down to the levels of people who cannot get 3 days off of work and come up to Brown for a conference. If you want to change, I mean, the change is going to come as the people who have the power to a certain extent retire and die off. And if we've educated, if we have educated, not just starting at college level, because half of our population doesn't go to college. That leaves some of this work needing to trickle down for as much as discussions at a very high level are necessary. It needs to trickle down. So I'm putting out that plug there in general for the movement of where this needs to go next.
Well, then I invite you to apply for my summer institute for secondary teachers on slave narratives, or any other of the 38 Gilder Lehrman Institute summer seminars for teachers. You need to be in those summer seminars.
Can I just follow up on this quickly, and by
You're in,
bringing another key player into the conversation? We've spoken about the universities, but what about the Smithsonian Museum as a catalyst of this trickle down?
No, yeah, indeed. I know, indeed.
I guess I think that there needs to be a basic understanding. I'm a little uncomfortable with the notion of knowledge generating solely from academia in general. I don't agree with that basic conception. And so I think that in fact is the purpose of this kind of work, to make sure that those things are destabilized. Because often, and especially in our environment, there is a need for the knowledge that is produced outside of academia to influence academia. And I think that especially because your notion of the deconstruction of race that was provided in that academic environment, in key ways, the false construction of race as biological was formulated within academia within generations prior. And so that's where I'm a little bit, we need to rework this relationship a little bit. And so that's all I want to say.
Yeah, just because I did notice, since our director's not here, that even though we're sponsoring this event, we're not really up on the stage right there. But I just want to remind you that we are there. And one thing that's been wonderful about the exhibit and about the museum opening is because people have not had access to this, and now suddenly it's there. And so I just want to tell you, please come to the museum. And also, if you can't come to the museum, we will be coming to you. We promise. What? Oh, and Mary said I should speak to freedom. We do not reify freedom as being a single thing. Obviously, who could? We talk about freedom in relation to slavery. We actually, at the very opening of the exhibit, say that slavery in many ways created a radical new concept, which is freedom. but then we unpack that throughout. So there's not a single notion of freedom, nor is freedom ever not contested in terms of its many forms.
It could be done easily by just recommending an article that was written, but my question is for Martin and Marcia, because I'm interested in what is the kind of politics of forgetting that comes with renaming. I'm interested in that primarily because I've always been interested in what I think is the haunting presence of certain kind of colonial structures, especially as reminders in my own location in Europe that we were a part of a horrific history. So what is that politics of renaming?
I personally do not have strong feelings about renaming, but as someone who is a sports fan, I know that edifices can be renamed for whoever pays the top dollar, and that when people say, well, you can't rename a building, I said, well, yes, you can do a number of things with a building, right? The hard part is doing stuff with the structure, and so one of the reasons why I was very happy to see the way that my university approached the question of these two buildings is that we understood it was not about the two buildings. It was about the way that, like I said before, a past was going to animate a series of decisions in the future. And I think that as other institutions seek our counsel, the first thing that I often say is, do not tie this to building names, because you have lost the opportunity to actually show the ways that we are constantly contending and we're constantly confronting a debt that is not repairable entirely. And so I think it's a cultural question, but I do think that the renaming is a powerful example to our students who are often invested in renaming as an entry point into a sophisticated point of politics.
That's really interesting because, in fact, the University of Cape Town made precisely the error that Georgetown is obviously aware of. So in the case of the University of Cape Town, it was believed that it was all about renaming. And therefore we have the tragedy of losing the historic fabric because of that mistake. And the opportunity was missed. This is why I mentioned the point of, it's an extremely unusual thing for the University of Senate's Cape Town to be unified in anything. There are 250 members of it with every opinion. Now, of course, there were 3 people who voted against, but there always are 3. It was essentially unanimous, but the sense that was driving that was that if we just got this statue down, it would all be over. And they missed that point completely. And so we lost the statue, which is the reference point, exactly your point that you're making, Wayne, and the problem still isn't solved because the point was missed. Now, spare a thought for a moment for another university in South Africa, which is called Rhodes University. Now, that university is now called by its students. It has now been renamed by the students as the university formerly known as Rhodes. So, that's an interesting way of dealing with it.
Can I quickly say, Wayne, quickly on renaming, this report that Yale just issued yesterday, which some of us worked on forever, it has 3 principles. I won't go into all of them. But one of the principles is if you rename, there's a responsibility not to erase, which means you commemorate, you exhibit, you do something that you don't just willy-nilly erase. And we had fascinating discussions of that. Anyway, but...
And also, just one thing, to be fair to my colleagues at different types of institutions, we name buildings after old Jesuits. They do not have family members or trusts that write us letters to say we are so sorry that our memory is gone. And I think that that context becomes very important in what gives us the power to make certain decisions and what other institutions have to grapple with. And I really respect that.
Could I just take the moment in the context of that renaming debate in Cape Town, just come back to the very important point about freedom, qualification about freedom, because that issue of freedom is precisely the issue that is driving the politics of a new generation in South Africa. It's exactly the generation that is meant to be what we call in South Africa the born frees, which is a generation who were born after the end of apartheid, who are meant to be the winners in the Mandela Revolution. They are the ones who are protesting. They're the ones. Now, when I said at the beginning of what I said that the student emptied excrement over the statue of Rhodes, which started this off, there was a point to that. It was a performance protest, because by emptying human excrement over the statue, he was referring to the failure of government to provide basic services in South African townships, where women, for instance, are too scared to use the toilets at night because of the risk of sexual violence. So there was a referencing there to a sense of betrayal. And there is a complete rejection in that generation, which is very difficult to take internationally, a complete rejection of Nelson Mandela as the symbol of freedom. A complete rejection. So this is a return. There's no longer talk of transformation. There is now talk of decolonization. There is a rediscovery of Fanon as the key figure driving that, and a rejection of what happened in 1994 by that time. Now, if you don't understand that, in that context, of course, there lie other political issues which I think are probably familiar in the context of the United States. So, of course, just as in the United States, you have a systematic evidence of economic and other forms of discriminatory behavior against people who are black, exactly in South Africa, you have the continuing economic disparities that, in fact, qualify that notion of freedom all the time. So in South Africa at the moment, the family of a teacher, a school teacher, in mid-career, cannot afford to send anybody in their household to a public university in South Africa, completely excluded from any participation in higher education. So, indeed, the qualification of freedom is what drives the politics that lie, in fact, behind this whole movement.
So time is up to us, unfortunately, so we have to wrap this up. But I would like to say thanks again to all the sponsors. This has been a fantastic event.
Yeah, could we ask Paul and Nancy to come up, please? That's our last thing. Thank you, Martin. Can I just go last? Please, I have a long list of names.
Go ahead. You want to go first?
No, go last. Since I'm the host.
Okay, before you all leave, we're going to do a couple of thank yous. A couple, more than a couple. I want to thank Michelle Zaks, our Associate Director at the Gilder Lehrman Center, not only for holding all the orange cards, but for doing all kinds of work before we ever got here. Thank you, Michelle. I want to thank our colleagues here who've been wonderful to work with in 1,000 ways. But back to the original question by Jennifer. Michelle's going to kick me for this, but last week I got an email among dozens and dozens and dozens of historians who started an email chain. It started with this group called Historians Against Slavery, and it flooded into other groups about how could, everyone's in despair over the election, how can we use what we do for the broader audience? Richard Rabinowitz mentioned the higher journalism. And so I stupidly offered the Gilder Lehrman Center and our new media director, who hasn't even done a day's work yet, we just hired him, to be a source or a clearinghouse of some kind in a careful way that we could begin to carefully blog about the problems we're living with in universities, out in the public. It might even become a kind of public history blog. rooted in the slavery story, but anywhere anyone wants to go. I say that now because we haven't even started it yet, although there are about 4 people who've written their blogs already and we haven't put them up. So stay tuned. Anyway, thank you all for coming.
I'm going to be quick because I see that Tony has a list of names, and so that absolves me from remembering everyone. But we work with the best colleagues in the world. You know, Nancy and Mary and I are, along with Deirdre Cross, who is here, and Rex Ellis, are incredibly grateful for the incredible collaborators that that Tony and David and your respective staffs have been. I mean, you guys have been tremendously generous and collaborative in all the best ways. And I can't emphasize that enough. And even to dealing with the timekeeping, you know, so thank you all for all this hard work this weekend. And I guess finally, thank you all for coming. We have learned from all of you, and we'll keep continuing to listen and learn to listen as the work of the museum continues to grow and move forward. Would you like to say anything?
One voice isn't enough. Oh, you're going to say
Sure? Yeah, sure. All right, let me begin by thanking a whole list of persons. This has been a very important conference. It has been, I think, a signature collaboration between the 3 institutions. And I want to first thank the leadership of the institutions for agreeing and for really collaborating with all of us to make sure that this happens. So thanks to David, thanks to the folks from the Smithsonian, you know, Lonnie, yourselves, and all yourselves, and Deirdre, and everybody. To get this going, we had many, many meetings, I think. Can't remember if we decided on Wednesdays. I don't remember what day we met. But we had many phone conversations just trying to get these things right. And collaboration is not an easy thing, quite frankly, because you always have to be thinking about each other. And what is it that you are doing, and you know, how do you offend, how you know exactly what is the purpose of this, and so on. So, and this one really went very smoothly. There were no major mishaps, and we were not talking to each other. I'm out of this, right? There was none of that. There was really respect for each other and a capacity, I think, to always modify and work with and do what needs to happen. There are some individuals who I think are really critical to this. From Yale, Eva, Melissa, Michelle, and David, obviously. I would like to thank all of you for working with us. There was a division of labor in this thing, and you all did the bookings and so on, right? So I would really like to thank you for doing that work and for coming. So thank you very much, those persons. For the folks at the Smithsonian, obviously, Deirdre, who's not here, but who was in a lot of the meetings, Paul, who's here, Rex, and I'm just talking about people who worked on the project in terms of the meetings, not people who aren't necessarily here. And Rex, and obviously Lonnie Bunch, who gave full support even though he's not here. So I really want to thank you all. In terms of the folks here, Ariel Brown, who's not here, but who was the person sitting down there doing a lot of the back and forth with you, and also holding up the yellow card, the orange cards. She's not
Card Brigade.
The Orange Card Brigade. There's obviously, there's people like Sandra Arnold, who worked here, Daniel, there's Marco, there's Noel, and people who are, we're doing the mics, Sophie, Jacob, Cherise Morris, who's Andrea, Island, Gerald, Dan Straker, who's not here, Amelia, who did a lot of the work here. She was here sometimes, but I'm not sure she's here now, and she's a postgrad. She's a Ruth Simmons postgrad. Emily Owens, who's a faculty fellow. Matt, who did a lot of the back and forth again with the mic. Kale, and then obviously, and then Michelle, who was one of the volunteers. I want to thank all those persons, and then to thank 3 other persons: the associate director of the center, Professor Ferreira, and then the really 2 anchors from here, 2 persons who anchored the organization of this conference from here, Maya Gamble Rivers and Shana Weinberg. And I would then like to thank you all very, very much for coming to this. I think you do not have a successful conference or workshop without participants. And it is the level of the participants, the level of the panelists and so on, that makes the workshop worthwhile. And this has been worthwhile because I think everybody here has made a major intervention and have something to say around this really very, very crucial question at a specific historic moment, which is one that we have to work through to get to the other side. The way I like to put it is that we are on the other side of the bank of the River Jordan, and we now have to work through to get and swim over to the other side of the River Jordan. And many rivers to cross, but one will get there through the work. Thank you very, very much.